My title may not sound like it's connected with Gary Becker, but as you'll see when I get into it, my whole take on the Industrial Revolution is sort of in several different ways built on Gary's work. So what do I mean by the Industrial Revolution? It's a kind of a loose term. I like the definition by Cole and Dean in this picture, and I just picked that off. It's from the first book first chapter in the 1966 Cambridge Economic History of Europe. And what these guys say, first of all, is, all of which I think is a beautiful statement, that it's a kind of watershed for humans, that you have this long stretch of kind of centuries of kind of Malthusian stagnation for ordinary working people. I mean, of course, there are many wealthy people, but ordinary working people just had no progress until sometime in maybe the 1700s or 1800s. So as they say, and after that, we've had a steady growth rate, not in every part of the world, but in the most successful countries. So it's now routine to think about, doubling every generation. So this is a new event, and it's irreversible apparently. I don't know how long it's going to go, but we've had a pretty good ride for the last 200 years, and the end isn't in sight. And a second feature that Cole and Dean talk about is that associated with this is a sort of migration from the rural part, from traditional agriculture, into a different world. I think of it as an urban world or a literate world. So I want to show you a couple of pictures of just how regular that fact is. So these are World Bank figures for cross-section. So it's a single year, 1980, but any year would have done. And you can see that there's this the connection between employment share of agriculture, which for the poorest countries is 80 or 90% of people in agriculture. And then, I'm sorry about the logs, but this means about $400 a year. There's nobody quite that low, but you can see. And then 10 is about $22 a year. This is in 1990 US dollars. So as countries get more prosperous, I'm not saying what's causing what here, you get a steady migration out of traditional agriculture and into something else. Now, it's not, the United States is way down at the bottom, or Argentina. We're 2 or 3% of our workforce is, so, and we're big exporters of goods. So it's not the high shared agriculture doesn't mean you're producing a lot of stuff. It just means you're using a lot of labor to produce whatever you can produce. That's what Schultz called as traditional agriculture. You're not talking about the United States or Canada or Europe. All right, here's some time series on employment shares in agriculture. Here the bottom axis are dates, and I just got India, Japan, US, and UK. This is Kuznets data from the 1970s, so I had to fake Kuznets for 2004, extend the stuff. Now this isn't exactly comparable to the cross sections, so I'm going to take this axis and replace it with the income these countries had at these different dates as measured by Angus Madison. And now you get the same data, but now we got the same idea of per capita income plotted against, and it's another nice downward sloping curve. And I actually fit a curve to this, which I won't bother you with. So here's the cross section. Here's the time series, and it's exactly the same curve. So in some sense, there's no calendar time isn't playing a role here. You get the same picture for a single cross section and a time series over a couple hundred years. There's just this connection between the shared agriculture and the prosperity of the country that holds up no matter what date it is. So the people in the upper left-hand corner, that's working people everywhere before 1750 or 1800, but when I'm calling the Industrial Revolution started. And there's still millions of people at this same level of poverty or subsistence living, but there's fewer of those people every year. That's what the Industrial Revolution means, I think, is this gradual evolution, which is still going on and still got a long ways to go. I should have some pictures on the second issue. I haven't shown you any population data, and I'm going to have to get into population data in this talk. But a common pattern, is that in poor economies, if something happens, new land is discovered, or some new way of using the land you've already got. In a poor society, people will have bigger families. They're richer. They spend a lot of it on families. So you get an increase in the population when something like that happens. But then, if whatever happened to make their lives better, as families, well, what I really want to say is, as people move down this curve, they take back the large family and and their family size starts reducing. So you get this demographic transition when a country starts to develop of an initial explosion. Think about Nigeria right now, or for that matter, well, England back in the early 19th century, 18th century, 19th century. And then you start getting this reduced. And this is something that Gary was thinking about, this complicated behavior of income, prosperity, and how that ties up with family size. He started thinking about that in the 1960s, looking at data from Indianapolis families. It was really data. Can't believe how hard it was to find data back in those days that was any good. And then he keeps coming back over the years to this question of kind of dual. Well, what he called it was the quantity-quality trade-off. That you could have, one thing you can do is with your children is to have more of them, and another one is to cut back on the number of children, but invest more in some way or another for the children. So think about that as quantity-quality trade-off. And what I described as a pattern in demographic transition is that you start out with quantity and then move into quality. And there's work starting from 1960, some work with Greg Lewis, but the work that I'm going to pretty much build everything on is a couple of papers with Robert Barrow in 1988, 1989, and then a 1990 paper with Kevin Murphy and Robert Tamura and Gary. And those papers are pretty much the basis for everything I'm going to say. What I'm going to do with them is to take two kind of extreme theoretical models. One will be a pre-industrial society of traditional farm workers, just solely talking about people in the upper left of that slides I showed you. And the other will be a sustained economy with sustained growth, which is driven entirely by human capital accumulation. So people just get more and more skill levels of working people just get higher and higher all the time. I'm not going to talk about physical capital at all. It would certainly be possible to do if I were actually measuring these quantities. I'd have to do it. But here I'll just the only accumulation here is knowledge. So these two economies are going to be completely different in the way they work. But what's going to hold things together, and this is a very Beckerian assumption, is that everybody, all these people have the same preferences. The nature of people aren't changing. It's the situations they find themselves in that are changing. And I want to keep that as a kind of ground rule here. So I want to start with a pre-industrial society. And I'm thinking this is the society that Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus were thinking about when they did their primary. So it's not, I'm not talking about backward or savages, or it's not Jared Diamond I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people whose books we read in college and who founded the religions that we have. You know, there's nothing backward about it, but in fact, it was a world in which the living standards of ordinary working people just didn't change. And when Ricardo started building his model of kind of the different classes, he was building it exactly on this idea. So to formalize it, this is pretty much an adaptation of what Barrow and Becker did. Write down a Bellman equation that describes the decision problem of a typical household in this world. And these guys have a unit of land. They're farmers. And X is how much acreage they have, and V of X is how much utility they get out of having this farm. But of course, how they do it is managing their farm and managing their family. So the arguments here are you like to consume goods yourself. I'm just going to talk about it as one person. I'm not going to get into the really good stuff about child raising here. So C is consumption of the adult. N is the number of kids you have. And then V, what you're going to do is your kids are going to split the farm. So if you have N kids and you got X units of labor, then each child gets X over N size farm. And then these guys are assuming that the value that your children have, this V of, is the same as your own. They have the same taste you do, but they may have a different size farm because you are, depending on what you bequeath to them. So the N is the quantity, and X over N is the quality in Becker's terms. And just for it makes life simpler, I'm trying to be as simple as I can, to use this kind of logarithmic function for the value. So I'm going to have, consumption raised to a power, number of workers raised to another power, and a value per worker to another power. So your family's going to maximize that. Your farm, X is going to give you a certain amount of consumption or goods over your lifetime. You're going to divide that up between the goods you consume yourself and the number of workers you have times K, where K is that, so how much you have to invest in each kid. So in this particular form that I've used, this function V is just something constant times the size of your farm raised to a power. And you have to do some work with this Bellman equation, but we can tell that's what the exponent looks like. So given that, you can work out and solve for the optimum family size. And of course, we better have eta, how much you care about your children, is large enough so the thing is positive. We're not going to allow you to have negative children. And this is the situation of an individual family in this world I'm describing to you. Okay, so let's think about a whole world full of people like this, whole economy like this. There's L acres of land in the economy as a whole, and then the population is going to change, or at least it could change. So the size of the typical family is going to be the amount of labor which is just there, amount of land which is just given, and how many people there are to divide it. So we can work out the population dynamics because NT, which is the population today, times NT, which is is how many children, little n is how many children each adult bears. So the little nt, this is bad. So big N times little n is equal to tomorrow's population. So you can work out the population dynamics in the next line, and you can see that you're converging. You're going to converge to a certain level of steady population. You kind of knew that, didn't you? And every constant. Well, population is constant. What's true, well, I must say it's not very well, is the changes in the quantity of land or changes in the productivity of land, which I use for this parameter A, movements in those things have no effect on the living standards of ordinary people here. It changes the population size and nothing else. That's the Malthusian character of this model. Now, my example that I worked out, everybody's the same, but it wouldn't be difficult, and or no particular. You can divide up the landholders and the farm workers any way you like, and you can have some with people with no land at all, just day laborers, and others with the pharaoh who does no work at all and collects all the rents. And the nature of the quantity-quality trade-off would be a little bit different, but it's always present and central in these variations. Malthusian theory's got kind of a bad rap. It's not a model of lemmings jumping off cliffs or people breeding themselves into starvation. That's not even rabbits don't breed like rabbits. They settle down into an equilibrium, which is just the rabbity kind of size. They don't get bigger, they don't get littler. So we got as a population settling down to a sustainable steady state determined by what's resources and how people feel is the right way to care for their children. It applies to traditional human society, applies to animal populations, and it's an empirical. This Malthusian model is empirically probably the best macroeconomic prediction that we've ever got. Maybe that's a small boast, but but you go prior to the Industrial Revolution, people all over the world had about the same living standards. Maybe you could probably even see it with skeletons, and some of these people are living in I call them Edens, like Java or South China. Lots of sun, lots of rain, soil you can work with, and people who are living on the Arctic Ocean, huddled up in igloos, or people living on the desert, and they all have about the same living standard. And, the difference is just that they have huge populations in South China and in Java, and hardly anyone lives in the other place. You get people distributed. The theory predicts the distribution of people across the world in a very nice way, and it's still, it's good stuff. But it doesn't. But it's had a bad since the 19th century. These predictions are there's no way to account for Hong Kong or Tokyo or New York City, but in this way. So for the modern world, I want to talk about a human capital economy. So it's going to be labor only. There's going to be productivity growth, which is generated in my model by meeting other people, by on-the-job progress, learning from the people around you. And this is going to be a significant, distinctive character of what I'm doing, the fact that this sort of social character of learning. I'm going to have schooling, just because that's what human capital theory talks about, and should. But in this setup, I'm going to describe what schooling does is you don't actually produce anything while you're in school, but it improves your ability to process ideas in your future career. So schooling is kind of and we'll talk about that. That's quite central to. All right, now I'm going to throw out a lot of math, and I'm not going to. I really love this stuff, but maybe it's not what I want to spend the rest of the talk on. We're going to have a distribution of people by characteristics, how skillful they are. I'm calling that Z. Everybody's got a skill level Z. And maybe how old they are. So I'm going to talk about S. I'm going to have a cohort structure here. And now I'm going to talk about big S is going to be schooling. But I'm not really going to do with anything right away about schooling, except to say that well, okay, I'll tell you about it. So I'm going to have a distribution of the whole society at time t, and then we'll talk about the distribution of each stratified, how many of particular ages and schooling backgrounds. We'll have a distribution within that group, and there's lots of variety in both. And these two distributions are kind of the state variable. They're the things that are going to evolve over time. I got a cohort structure, so I want to have some kind of death rate. So I'll just take that as a given feature that's not changing over time and not affected by anything anybody does. I mean, all these things are just to try and keep something easy enough so I can figure out what it implies. And as you're going to see at the end of the talk, I have too much complications, not too little. People are going to draw from the people around them in a random fashion. These are working people, and they get these draws at a particular rate, which I'm calling alpha, and alpha is later on going to depend on how much schooling you've got. But for each guy, alpha is a given it's the rate at which you meet other people. What do you do when you meet somebody? Your Z is your productivity level. You meet somebody, meet means read about it in a book, bump into them on the street, you know, I don't know. It's not a club or anything. And then if you run into some new idea, it's better than yours, you take the largest one. So it's got to be a growth system, right? Because you always have the option to choose to move from what you're doing to what he's doing. But if that move doesn't help you, you don't do it. So that's the model. And I got to have that your draws don't have a limit. There's a Pareto tail. There's always people you can meet that'll tell you something. Now some people get nervous about this. Having an infinite, somewhere in this world, you know, there's, it's an infinity of people, and there's really only a finite number of people. That's a problem, but it's not a very big problem because we got 8 billion. Or you can just think about drawing ideas. You can think about breaking it down into getting new ideas that no one's ever seen before and getting ideas from somebody else. But really it contributes nothing to have that segregation between imitation and innovation in terms of the behavior of the system. So that's my my world. We can work out the evolution of those. I'm going to skip through that. We can simplify this stuff by assuming that there's a certain distribution that lets you break down the evolution of these distributions in terms of a location parameter, like a mean, and a variance parameter, which can be which measures how much variance there is within each cell. And if the Fauché distribution's got the property that these mean-like things, the location parameters, evolve over time, and the variance parameters stay fixed. So what you're reducing a problem of the evolution of some probability distributions with the evolution of some scalars. A hugely simpler simpler problem. And now what I wanted to simplify still more by focusing on a balanced growth path. So I want to look at equilibria in which this location parameter grows at some rate gamma as constant. Just see if we can find a solution to the problem which has that property. And the answer is yes. And it's this formula. And what this picture says, I'm trying to solve for gamma. And you see gamma on the left. That's this rate of progress. And here's gamma on the right. So I want to plot the left-hand side against the right-hand side and see where they intersect. And here's the issue. So they have to. They always intersect at 0. So 0 means the system's not growing at all. You're never actually going to be down here. This would be a negative growth rate. And the positive growth rates, which is what we're trying to think about in the Industrial Revolution, is got to be the only one is the red dot, the red curve. And these curves always have the same curvature. So there's only two. You can have a negative thing plus 0, or you can have 0 plus a positive thing. the only things you could observe would be the zero, which is a stagnation economy, and the rate at which people process this alpha, this beating rate, the higher it is, the higher your growth rate is going to be. So the red curve is a rate of 0.08. These numbers don't mean anything to you, but and the blue curve is 0.02. So the faster people are, the more rapid these meetings are, the more likely you are to have a growing economy. But either a growth economy, both growth and stagnation are possible within this little world as long run possibilities, which I think is kind of interesting. Now, if I were a Marxist, I would call these guys this group of human capitalists or whatever, call them the bourgeoisie. They're people who live by their knowledge and generate knowledge that affects other people. This thing didn't. People like this didn't emerge in the 18th century. You know, they've been around since prehistoric days. We know there have been merchants and traders, shippers. Not everybody's been digging potatoes in these worlds. So what's so whatever the Industrial Revolution is, it's not a question of there weren't any people with human capital, educated, literate people before the Industrial Revolution. That's just not true. It's not even slightly true. So we have to. We want a model that will accept that. That will be consistent with that. And this model where we have two possible equilibria admits that as a possibility. All right. So where am I headed here? And this really is Becker, Murphy, and Tamura in what they were trying to do as well. Let me wait. I want to get to schooling, and I want schooling to play the role of something you bequeath to your kids. Okay, just instead of the farm, you put your kid through college, and that gives him higher earning levels. It's kind of the analog to the little model I started out with. But then I want this thing to be something that people choose, not just a number that I gave them. It's easy to avoid this, but I don't want to. I want to keep it simple. Everyone's going to make the same choice. Everyone's got the same ability. Everyone's going to choose the same S. So the model's going to look just like the one I've just described, except now you get to deviate from S if you want to, and it won't. You're one of many, so it won't affect the world's economy if you do deviate. So I want to work that problem out, and we're going to call it an equilibrium now. If nobody wants to deviate, S has got the property that everyone's happy with it. Everyone has the right to do something else, and they don't choose to do it. I want to take the machinery I've ground out and try and figure what the expected present value is of a given person. If he chooses the schooling level S, then he doesn't work between 0 and S, so he's going to give up, he's going to postpone his earnings. But then he's going to get a higher earnings rate later on because he's learned something. All right, so I can work out his earnings from the internal from the model, but I guess you'll have to take my word on that. And I can work out the expected present value of a person's earnings in this particular model. And I'm going to assume that, nobody dies while he's in school. It simplifies things a lot, and it's about as, pretty close to the truth. Now, if we keep extending schooling longer and longer, I suppose a lot of us are going to die in school, but so far it hasn't been a big problem. And that leads me to a pretty simple description of the problem, the decision problem. Here I've got some stuff that doesn't depend on your big. You're choosing big S here, and choosing a choosing a higher S means you're going to absorb more knowledge from other people faster. And the alpha of S to the power theta expresses that. That's the good thing about schooling. The bad thing is you got to wait until you get out of school in order to start earning anything. And that's the e to the minus rs. And all the rest of the stuff is just stuff that happens from the outside. You're living in a world that's growing, so everybody's present values are growing. And I'm thinking about a balanced growth path, so they're all going at some constant rate, and all I got to do is find one number, gamma, that describes that rate. So that's the setup, and I can give you some examples. You're maximizing, who did it in logs, you're maximizing your present value. Gives you a first order condition. For a particular, how much does S affect your ability to process information? I'm going to imagine it's equal to some constant times S raised to some power. So this power phi is like the degree at which more schooling affects your information processing. So the optimum schooling in this system, everyone's doing the same thing, but everyone had an option to do something else. It's higher if the high search intensity is more valuable. All right. So what we're trying to do is to understand a world in which a lot of people move from some low-skilled occupation like traditional agriculture, start investing in learning, human capital. They're doing it because it's going to give them a reward. It's going to pay off for them. There's going to be jobs out there for them, and you turn from a stagnant economy to an economy that's growing. And the discount rate R means that your opportunity cost of going to school is large, so that reduces your but the other features, how much your search intensity is improved by schooling, how much those searches are rewarding because you're meeting people who have something to tell you. Those things together are this theta and phi. So we still have this same program, the same formula that this gamma, which determines how fast the system is growing. The GDP is growing at gamma times theta in this world. But in this case, the level of schooling is a matter of choice. And I want to say this, I'm not going to do anything about this, but it's crucially important for us, is this can't be an efficient equilibrium. because individual agents are learning from others. We all benefit from the people around us, and the smarter they are, the more we benefit. But but nobody, everyone's focusing entirely on his own earnings. So there's a gap between a big external effect. And you know, for schooling, everyone knows that. I mean, that's why we have a school system that tries to make up for this external effect. Well, how well we do that or not, I don't know, but it would be surprising if that didn't show up in a decent model. All right, now what does this have to do with a quantity-quality trade-off? Well, so far nothing. Who needs it? And this puzzled me for a while, but implicitly the model I just described involves some kind of perfect capital market where I can choose my own schooling, forget about my father or mother. I can choose my own schooling level, borrow it, and then pay off when I earn it. You know, I mean, so it involves a capital market where you can finance your own education and pay it back later. And as we know, as we're finding more all the time, that's not the way things work in this world. So we've got to add, to get the quantity-quality trade-off, I've got to add this, incorporate into the model this fact that your parents have to chip in and finance your schooling. So what I'm going to do in this final thing, and this is really quite Becker, Murphy, Tamura, is I'm going to take the fraction. You're going to have to use a fraction of your production capacity to affect your children's schooling level. So I'm going to write delta is some parameter that n is how many kids you have. What I've done is work out a model in which parents choose how much they're going to schooling they're going to give to their children, and the choice depends on first of all how much schooling benefits for them, how much that's obvious, and then what kind of world they're in. Schooling in the model I've just described means you get to interact. You get good at finding out what other people are doing, what they know, and transmitting that for your knowledge. If you're in a setting with a lot of good people, that's worth a lot. If you're in an agricultural society where nobody really knows anything, then why go to school? So the schooling level, the incentives for schooling are going to depend on the people you're with. All right, so what am I going to do? Believe me, I got two models, one of which has steady growth built entirely on human capital accumulation, and another model where it's a stagnation and a Malthusian world. And now what I want to do is put these things, imagine these two groups, put them in the same place and let them move back and forth. And that's going to give me, for sure, and this is the easy part, the return from being in the bourgeois sector, the human capital sector, is you're getting richer and richer. People are getting better and better all the time. So your incentives to move, however, it's not obvious how to describe that mobility, but wherever they are, you can stay in your stagnant economy, or you can move out into the. So people are going to flow from the backward sector into the. They're going to get seduced by the better and better, the faster growth of that section. So you're going to get exactly the slide I showed you at the start, where progress means moving out of traditional agriculture and into what I've called human capital land, or That's pretty easy to develop, and I and other people have done similar stuff in the past. What I want to do here is, the other side of the quantity-quality trade-off is this demographic transition. It's not that people are, it's not a question of the fraction of people in this sector or that sector. Now, if we're talking about, because the number of the population is changing at the same time. And if I had more time, I still wouldn't be able to tell you how that plays out. I thought it was going to be easy, and maybe it is easy. You know, when you get it figured out, everything's easy. But I'm not sure that the setup I've described to you, and I haven't described in a lot of the details. Like, for example, how do I get from, you know, I'm an illiterate farm worker, and I leave the farm and go into the big city. How do I get access to schools, and who pays for it? Are they the same schools? You know, there's a lot of real questions involved in that, in those transitions. It's not just a question of moving from one job to another. It's a question of because your skill levels and the skill levels that are required are quite different in the two worlds. So that stuff has to be spelled out, and whatever the answer is, it's going to look a lot like Becker, Murphy, and Tamura, I hope. So let me stop here.